Chapter 17, Los Alamos Visit. In 1945, Maria Gopert Mayer visited Los Alamos. She left her children with a nursemaid and did not tell Joseph Mayer where she was going or why. On arriving in New Mexico, she met with Laura Fermi, whose family had been living in Los Alamos since the summer of 1944. Although she had not told her husband the reason for her trip, he sensed that his wife was involved in the development of the bomb, though he did not know to what extent. As much as he wanted to know, he was aware of the secret nature of the experiments and tried not to push her to disclose more than she was comfortable revealing. Joseph Mayer had also been invited to join the confidential project, but he had refused, unable to take the endeavor seriously. He found the idea of building such a weapon ridiculous and did not want to become entangled in a project that would certainly end in failure, he told officials. However, Joseph did not know that Enrico Fermi had been able to operate the first atomic pile beneath the stands of the University of Chicago Stadium, and he also did not know of the work happening at Oak Ridge or Hanford, much less at Los Alamos. From Maria's point of view, it was a strain on her marriage to keep that secret from Joseph. She also feared for Germany and its people. She despised Adolf Hitler, but loathed the idea of harm coming to the good people of her country. As Maria traveled to Los Alamos and toured the facilities, she was overwhelmed with fear. She tried to pinpoint what the gnawing presentiment was about and realized that two factors were nagging her. She was worried that Hitler and his scientists had already advanced far enough in their designs and constructed a bomb. And she was also afraid that the Americans would soon succeed in building and detonating the bomb themselves. As a scientist, she wanted to see an experiment come to fruition. She wanted to see the work come to light. And yet, what would happen when it did? How many innocent lives would be lost because of their doings? And how many lives would be lost because of the doings of a madman? Her internal conflict was originally ignited by loyalty to her mentors. Max Born, the man she had gone to when her father passed away, the man who had put aside his own inner demons to help her wrestle with hers, had refused to help the British in their atomic projects, and James Frank, her former professor, had raised loud questions about the morality of unleashing such a powerful bomb on innocent people. Few had listened to him. She knew that her husband would be able to understand her sense of loyalty to her family and friends, to her nation, and, to a certain extent, to the good people who still existed in Germany. Yet she could not tell him, and she certainly could not tell her children. She felt torn, and that rip was destroying her. Chapter 18, Coming to America. Elizabeth Rona was still in Europe. The finicky American immigration policies were not allowing her to travel, and she was becoming antsy. U.S. officials had already invited Elizabeth's friend Lise Mertner to visit Los Alamos to see how their work was progressing and what they were planning. They had nearly begged her to go, but Lise had declined. Officials knew she was happy in Sweden, and they had come to believe that time away from her current environment would be good for her and for them. They had made many offers and tried to entice her with a terrific visiting schedule to Los Alamos, but she always said no. She knew that it was not out of generosity that the Americans had asked her to travel to the United States, nor to simply look at their facilities. It was because they wanted her to work on the bomb. The British delegation heading to Los Alamos also tried to persuade Lise to join them as their guest in New Mexico, but she had once again adamantly refused. "I will have nothing to do with the bomb," she told them, and this time more firmly. The idea that people could die because of something she had done weighed heavily on Lise, although it had not always been so. In fact, early in her career, morality had not even entered her mind. She could pinpoint the precise moment when she began to question a scientist's place in the grand scheme of things and her own responsibility towards others. She recalled that day in Berlin. In 1914, World War I had broken out. Hahn had been called into service by the German army, and within their circle he was no longer Professor Hahn, but Lieutenant Hahn. One day, in full uniform, he had spoken at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry to a group of scientists and professors, many of whom were about to leave the institute to perform their own military duties. Lise appeared not to understand the gravity of the situation. "But why now?" she asked Hahn. "Just when we've hit upon isotopes?" It struck some as an unusually selfish way to be looking at the outbreak of war, but then she had never been confronted with the possibility of war before. She too would have to do her part, she was told. She was going to become an X-ray nurse at the Austro-Hungarian army, where she would come face to face with the perils of war and the damages of conflict, both on the body and on the mind. In a way, she was following in the footsteps of her idol. Marie Curie had also left her laboratory for the battlefield, driving a vehicle people had dubbed the Little Curie, upon which she carried X-ray equipment and other materials used on the front lines. Did Marie Curie reflect on the horrors of war? Did she face the moral dilemmas Lise was now pondering? There was no way of knowing, but Lise suspected that it was impossible to come face to face with the evil of combat and not wonder about one's role in it. As she helped the wounded and looked at their X-rays, Lise was shocked by what she saw. The injuries were horrendous, insidious, and deadly, and more often than not, the patients died a long and painful death. But as she considered those deaths, she also thought of Marie and Pierre Curie, whose lives had inspired her own. The Curies had worked as much as possible because they had suspected that radium existed, that it was there to be discovered. It was their scientific curiosity that had prompted them to move forward, not some grand design. The same scientific curiosity to discover had pushed Lise's own work. That the Curies' curiosity led to X-rays was a beneficial outcome, but one they had really not intended. It had happened. It had just happened. The radium could also kill those who inhaled it for too long. The brutal conditions, the gruesome wounds that Lise saw gave her a deeper understanding of human nature and of her role as a scientist in the world at large. She felt a growing obligation to ask questions she had never bothered with before. Did she have a responsibility toward her fellow human beings? Did she have to think about the repercussions of what she did before she embarked on experiments? And if so, should the answers stop her from more elaborate scientific inquiries? Things no longer seemed as clear-cut as they had during the early university days. Now another war was being fought, and she decided she did not want to go to America and leave her family and friends in Europe, not knowing what would happen to them. She would rather take her chances in Europe, she told everyone. She wanted to remain where she was, she repeated to the British and Americans. She did not want to have anything to do with a bomb. Unlike Lise Meitner, Elisabeth Rona had decided to leave Europe. She felt there was no reason for her to remain in Hungary any longer than necessary. She watched as her country was threatened on both sides. To the east, there were the Russians, and to the west, the Germans. She hoped that Hungary would remain free, but there was no reason for her to stay. Her application to go to the United States through the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars had been denied. This program, which found teaching positions in American universities for teachers, scientists, and scholars persecuted by the Nazis, had seemed like the perfect way out of Europe for her. She had not been surprised by the denial, though she was deeply disappointed. Elizabeth would have to find another way to reach America. She did receive a visitor visa, which allowed her to enter the United States for a limited period. Before leaving, she took a short detour to Vienna to visit a friend who picked her up at a train station and drove her to the home of her former boss, Stefan Meyer. There she found old friends who had gathered to say their goodbyes. Despite the fact that her scientific skills were needed on the Manhattan Project, Elizabeth had yet to hear from any of the project's officials. She was confident that eventually something would open up that would make use of her talents. In the meantime, she walked the streets of her new city. She loved New York City, the excitement that permeated its neighborhoods and its streets. In fact, she enjoyed everything about this new country, particularly the fact that in America she didn't need to hide what little money she had behind wood paneling, as she had as a young woman. Her favorite activity became strolling through Central Park, looking at the blooming flowers, as she often couldn't help recalling childhood days in Hungary and the early spring days she had spent with her grandmother watching nature come to life. To the older woman's delight, Elizabeth was the grandchild who shared her fascination with nature, who did not mind observing a plant as it developed day by day and jotting down its progress. In a journal, who didn't mind admiring the different shades of green as they intensified, and who didn't mind charting the growth of the pine tree her grandmother had planted as a sapling decades earlier. As a child, Elizabeth had learned to speak French from a family that came every summer to stay near her relatives and whose 3 boys taught her the language. It came in handy later as her career as a scientist blossomed. Scientists often arrived at their home to study with her father, an eminent physician. Elizabeth also had a sister, Marie, and these scientists from all over Europe and from places as far away as Japan had delighted the girls with tales of their countries and taught them bits of their own languages. Thus, the girls had become comfortable with people of every nationality, color, and creed. As Elizabeth waited to find work in the United States, she mentally performed the experiments for which she had become well known while working in European laboratories. The same experiments she had performed alongside Lise in Berlin. Some 4 months after arriving in New York, she attended the annual meeting of the American Physical Society, where employers looked for potential candidates. There she met a European scientist, Karl Hertzfeld, who was a well-known theoretical physicist at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. They talked about their new lives in America, and Elizabeth Rona told him of her inability to land a job related to science. She also explained that she would need a place to work once her visa expired in order to extend her stay. Would she be interested in teaching at Trinity College in Washington, D.C., he asked. He knew they were looking for a faculty instructor to teach chemistry and other science classes. Elizabeth Rona said yes. Teaching would not be difficult for her. She had sharpened her teaching skills early in her career at the University of Budapest when Dr. Francis Tangel, a famous biochemist and physiologist, hired her to write and teach courses that complemented the training of his graduate students. She had found it a strange spot to be in. She was the only woman in the program, and she was younger than the students for whom she was putting together the courses. These were medical students, and they reminded her of the wish she had held of becoming a doctor herself, a dream erased by her father's adamant opposition. Oddly enough, that teaching experience turned out better than she had anticipated. Of course, she knew that the situation would be markedly different in Washington, D.C. at Trinity, but she suspected that she would thrive there as well. She always did. While preparing to move to Washington, D.C., she often recalled her earliest days in America. Not so many months before, she had known that some of her former colleagues had ended up in New York and had gone to work at Columbia University, and so it was there that she headed as soon as she landed. In the physics department at Columbia, she met not only Fermi and Szilard, but also several other scientists she had known intimately in Europe, and a handful she had never met before. And she thought of the earliest women researchers with whom she had crossed paths, the ones who had been her colleagues and had become her friends. They had learned from one another and traveled together to various European laboratories to study and learn. But it seemed that things were done differently in the laboratories of the United States. At Columbia, no one spoke to her, and she didn't know what to make of that fact. She could have easily talked shop with any of these people, as by the time she landed in the United States, she had already worked with Lise and Hahn and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, with Meyer at the Institute of Radium Research in Vienna, and with the Curies in Paris. But no one spoke to her about science or anything else. Even a young scientist she had known quite well, and to whom a mutual friend had asked her to extend his hellos, simply turned away and walked off. She did not know it then, but there were FBI agents at Columbia. They were questioning everybody about her visit there. She, a European scientist with a visitor visa, traipsing in a laboratory where a secret project was taking place. They feared that she was a German spy sent to the United States to infiltrate the laboratories, uncover their secret operations, and report back to her superiors.